more important than stopping fascism, because fascism will stop us all.
You come in at the top of my shit list, even though you look a little punk rock. You talk real loud, but you're totally witless. Think we had enough of you, and you talk so you lie. Think a dream that you thought it would be, so you cry and you scream like a cat in a tree. Now you want a medal just for being a white boy. That ain't the way we do it no more. That ain't the way we do it no more. That ain't the way we do it no more. You got away with that shit before. That ain't the way we're gonna do it no more now. I wish you'd never come out of that foxhole. Thought we were rid of you back in 45. Your baby Jesus won't save your soul. He said you better leave your neighbor alive. So your life ain't a dream that you think you deserve. And the kids on the street really get on your nerves now. You want a medal just for being a white boy. That ain't the way we do it no more. That ain't the way we do it no more. That ain't the way we do it no more. You got away with this shit before. That ain't the way we're gonna do it no more now. So you want a white nation, mass deportation. Keep the white man rich and keep the women in the kitchen. Ha! But that ain't the way we do it no more. That ain't the way we do it no more. You got away with that shit before. That ain't the way we're gonna do it no more. That ain't the way we're gonna do it no more now. Oh. So you say we should go back where we came from, thinking maybe that you should as well. Put your money where your mealy little mouth is and go right back to hell.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the music video. It's so great to see you all, comrades. Welcome back to the second session of our Fascism and Global Class Struggle series. We are very excited for today's topic because it's going to be on communist responses to fascism. And so we are excited to hear from folks and, you know, to see the exchanges in the different groups. My name is Claudia de la Cruz, just in case you just joined the course today, which is possible. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Gabriel, and I'll see you all again in a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Claudia. It's great to see everybody, even if it's only virtual, and we're all really excited about the discussion for today. What I'm going to do is start by a very brief recap from last time, and then use it as a kind of springboard to introduce some new material. And the first part of my presentation will focus on the Communist International's responses to fascism. After the break and the breakout groups, then the second part of my presentation will focus on the Black Panther Party and the way in which they picked up on certain elements from the United Front strategy that we'll talk about in the common term. So if you've received the document, you'll see there's just kind of a skeleton outline to keep people on track and to make sure that all of the kind of key information is communicated. One of the primary things that we highlighted last time is the importance of a historical materialist approach to fascism. And so in its most succinct form, of course, historical materialism is a science that provides a holistic analysis of the social totality as it transforms over time. And it also identifies the driving forces behind historical change so that these forces can be mobilized in favor of the people. In this regard, it is a science that is not only intent on interpreting the world, but of course, changing it. And from a historical materialist point of view, it's important not only to recognize that fascism is historical and changing and takes on different forms, but also to be able to identify the root causes of fascism so that those can be combated and not only its kind of superficial manifestations, if you will. And there's a big difference from a lot of the liberal accounts of fascism, which do not focus on political economy, do not even mention capitalism at times, and only concentrate on certain ideological elements such as white supremacy or ultranationalism or other such things. One of the other elements from last time was the importance of a dialectical approach. And dialectics in its most succinct form is just a method of analysis that's grounded in the recognition that all phenomena are interrelated. Nothing is isolated and stands alone. They form a complex totality and they develop over time. The reason this is important is because our static conceptual categories are very poor tools of analysis when it is a matter of capturing the process of complexities that go into any social and historical phenomenon. In this regard, then, dialectics encourages us to recognize our concepts as tools and to render them as flexible and supple as possible so that we don't get hung up on just defining the purity of our concepts and we stop interrogating the specificity of the material world. We also introduced these three different scales of materialist analysis, drawing partially on Gramsci and the Gramscian heritage. The conjunctural, right, is just a specific place in time. And that's mainly what we looked at last time, is how fascism manifested itself in the interwar period in Europe. We're going to extend this analysis in the coming sessions to a structural account of a particular era of capitalism, the early 20th century, and as well to a systemic perspective on the deep history of capitalism. The Dimitrov text that you read from today, I think really goes to the heart of this when he claims, quote, "It would be a gross mistake to lay down any sort of universal scheme of the development of fascism, valid for all countries and all peoples. Such a scheme would not help, but would hamper us in carrying on a real struggle." It's a clear manifestation of a solid historical materialist and dialectical approach to the question of fascism. In one of the registration or pre-registration questions that we got from Wari, who is in a pre-branch formation, they wrote, quote, "What is and isn't fascism, and how can we help teach others on the true definition of fascism, especially after the insurrection and Trump?" So the working definition of fascism that I put in the Google Doc is the following, and I'll say a little bit about this. A response to capitalist crisis and the threat of communism, right? These are the two primary contextual elements that drove the rise of classical fascism in Europe. But fascism itself is an aggressive form of class warfare that's funded by the capitalist ruling class, right? This isn't simply organic and bottom up. It is very much a top-down project as well, right? It uses mass communications and propaganda to mobilize sectors of civil society, right? So it's not just a military dictatorship, it's not just authoritarian state power, it's actually an ideological project as well that's trying to galvanize part of the general population. And it galvanizes that population around an ultranationalist, imperialist, anti-communist, and ultimately anti-democratic project, right, of spiritual rejuvenation that's centered on the construction of a hyper-militarized state. One of the questions that we got, actually, I believe this is from the chat last time, is from Kevin from Albuquerque, who said, "So fascism is like a tool used by a variety of capitalists globally to preserve the system of capitalism." And in a certain sense, that is a very good, succinct definition of fascism as it kind of functioned in this classical moment. And I would just add to that, that it developed really in the 20th century and had two faces that we'll talk about a bit today. Gramsci was one of the people who really theorized this. One of the faces of fascism is the conservative voting bloc. The other face of fascism is the kind of reactionary face, meaning the terrorist street gangs. And they often function in close complicity with one another, and we need to identify both of them as obviously enemies of the people. The other element that I wanted to touch on from last time is that we primarily focused on what we might want to call state-centered fascism. Meaning, in the case of Italy and Germany, we had both conservative and reactionary forces that were working through bourgeois democracy internally with an extra-legal faction that crushed any opposition. And the goal was to take over state power. But there are other manifestations of fascism, some of which we'll look more into in the coming sessions. One we could refer to generally as para-state fascism, And again, parastate simply means alongside the state, operating in parallel structures. And parastate fascism is a way of outsourcing state violence and capitalist violence to vigilante forces, to organized crime, in order to enforce capitalist rule and also provide plausible deniability on the part of the state and the corporatocracy, thereby maintaining the kind of myth of liberal governance, right? The KKK I mentioned last time, as far as I know, was never intent on seizing state power because there were already white supremacist, pro-capitalist imperialists in power, for one, and because their job was different than that of taking over the state, as we saw in the case of classical fascism. But we also discussed briefly imperialist fascism in the precise sense that there were dictatorial and authoritarian regimes propped up by Western imperial powers. We mentioned in particular like the Pinochet regime, or all of those regimes involved in Operation Condor in Latin America would be good examples of this, that ultimately were dependent upon the imperial backing of the capitalist core. And so that relationship is slightly different because it wasn't about mobilizing as much, at least, of a base as in the case of Italy and Germany, but rather it was the local militaries and police forces and certain death squads that did the bidding of the capitalist core, right? So all of these imperialist relations, I think, are an important part of the picture that we need to have an analysis of. I would also like to respond briefly. Eric from San Diego asked, would Japan in World War II be considered fascist? I think it's an excellent question, in part because one of the important perspectives from historical materialists is an internationalist perspective, right? So we cannot maintain the Eurocentrism of certain debates on fascism, which only located in Europe and often try to particularize it in Europe. Moriya Fumio established a theory in 1949 of what they referred to as emperor system fascism, which was a description of the system in Japan. They posited the thesis of the enduring absolutist nature of the emperor system that came out of like late 19th century, well, earlier than that, of course, but it had its most recent origins in late 19th century Japan. But it gradually acquired fascist functions. And there was a fusion, according to Fumio, and Bix is another author who has studied this. There was a fusion between the emperor system that goes all the way back to feudalism and monopoly capitalism that developed a kind of Japanese style of fascism. And we can see this by relating it to our working definition. Japan, Imperial Japan, was anti-communist, pro-capitalist, ultra-nationalist, imperialist, right? It had colonies in Taiwan, in Korea, in South Manchuria. It was anti-democratic, and it was centered on a hyper-militarized state. And just very quickly, this is a note that came up. I was just looking through the chat to make sure that we try to address all questions. The book that I mentioned, there was some debate on it, is The Myth of the Good War, if people are interested in it. Nick Stender pointed this out. The Myth of the Good War, America in the Second World War by Jacques Pauwels. There were some few other questions, but I think that we'll get to them eventually. So I'm going to get on to the main part of my presentation for the first section today is on the communist responses to fascism. And I'd like to very briefly go over the formation of the internationals because they're important for the way in which the Comintern conceptualized social fascism. I'm going to be very quick on this, but the dates are in the Google Doc. As most people hopefully know, because unfortunately public history is so dominated by the important dates in the history of capitalism that people tend to know 1776, but not 1864. They tend to know July 4th, right, but not 1917 and things like that. But the first international was founded in 1864 and it lasted till 1873. And it was an international working man's association. It was composed largely out of trade council activists, and it functioned as a kind of mutual aid society to organize solidarity between workers who are engaged in strikes and other struggles. Of course, Marx and Engels were involved in the first international, Bakunin was as well. It was the first attempt to really link the different struggles of workers across nation state boundaries. It began to flounder around the point of the Paris Commune and the kind of reactionary forces in the wake of the Paris Commune of 1871. And the Second International then came about in the 1880s as an attempt to reestablish an international network, but it was focused more specifically on an international network of political parties, right? Not just trade union councils and things of this nature, in which there would be elected leadership, political programs, a kind of membership base in each country, and each national section would then report to the international in order to have a kind of nested form of hierarchical leadership. And it's the German Social Democratic Party that was really one of the core forces behind the Second International. This is important because the German socialists ended up founding establishing a coalition with the Lassallean General German Workers' Union. And one of the foundations for the kind of orientation of the Second International was the Gotha program that was published in 1875. And this was a kind of party platform that was adopted by the nascent Social Democratic Party of Germany. And in short, so that we don't get hung up on the details, because I don't want people to get turned off by this history. I want them to see the big picture and connect the dots so that we can kind of make this relevant to contemporary organizing. The Gotha program, and hence one of the core driving forces behind the Second International, presented a moderate, evolutionary way to socialism that was opposed to the more revolutionary program that you had in Marx and Engels. And so Marx and Engels themselves responded to the Gotha program and criticized it resolutely. Marx wrote, quote, "For nearly 40 years, we've raised to prominence the idea of the class struggle as the immediate driving force of history, and particularly the class struggle between bourgeois and proletariat as the great lever of modern social revolution," right? So class struggle and revolutionary class struggle should be at the center of our political projects. We cannot, he goes on to write, therefore go along with the people who openly claim that the workers are too ignorant to emancipate themselves, but must first be emancipated from the top down by the philanthropic, big and petty bourgeois, right? So you have a livid critique of one of the foundational aspects of the Second International. The German Social Democratic Party, moreover, took a position that's referred to as that of social chauvinism during World War I, meaning that they vigorously supported the war on the basis of a kind of nationalist platform of defending their workers internally in each individual nation state. This led to a split in some of the social democratic forces, and particularly within Germany, where the revolutionary Marxists began to forge a kind of left-wing element within the social democratic parties. And in particular, in the case of Germany, the Spartacists were particularly important for this. And I'm sure some of you are aware of this, for their critique of the social democratic support of World War I, because they saw it as a capitalist war, right? Which was using workers as cannon fodder for capitalist accumulation. And in that regard, they stressed the importance of violence only being used as a necessary tool to overthrow one's own government. And they therefore agitated for the common social relations between all workers. Rosa Luxemburg, of course, and Karl Liebknecht were at the forefront of the Spartacist movement. And they were some of the driving forces behind the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919. The reason this moment is important is because the Spartacists, after a kind of spontaneous uprising that was taking place in Germany, began to take the leadership of a more revolutionary attempt to overthrow the government. And the Kaiser actually left Germany. So there was a lot at stake, and they were building power within Germany. And this led to a tug of war between the Social Democrats, who were more reformist, and the Revolutionary Spartacist League. And eventually, I won't go into the details here just in the interest of time, but the final consequence of this is that the Social Democrats ended up arresting some of the Spartacist leaders and putting them to death, right? So the class struggle operative between the Social Democrats and the revolutionary, more kind of Leninist wing led to an extreme bifurcation in which the Social Democrats came to be identified as defenders of capitalism and imperialism, as opposed to true defenders of workers' interest and revolutionary politics. And it's in that regard, then, that we can understand, in relationship to this, the founding of the Third International, which took place in 1919. It was eventually dissolved in 1943 by Stalin. As that I'm sure a lot of you know, of course, this was in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and the orientation of the Third International was resolutely in favor of working through electoral mechanisms, but recognizing that you can only really take state power away from capitalists if there is an armed struggle to seize that power. And the other aspect, I just highlighted this briefly in the Google Doc, that's really important is, of course, the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist orientation. The Bolsheviks, of course, were against the support of World War I, or entering into World War I, and then established a platform that was for the liberation of all peoples around the world. And so the Third International has a very clear orientation in that regard. I've just quoted Ho Chi Minh because he's such a fan of the Third International and Leninism here, where he writes, "Lenin was the first to realize and assess the full importance of drawing the colonial peoples into the revolutionary movement. He was the first to point out that without the participation of the colonial peoples, the socialist revolution could not come about." In this regard, I think that one of the things that's important to recontextualize some of what we talked about regarding fascism last time is that fascism can also be understood as the capitalist ruling class's response to a dual problem that can be seen in the development of the Second and Third Internationals. One problem is the growing social democratic movement, which meant that there were increasing number of progressive forces who were working through electoral mechanisms to gain power, right? And that included, of course, revolutionary socialists who were using the electoral mechanisms in order to do that. And the second threat, of course, as of 1917, was the threat of Bolshevism. And that dual threat, I think, also allows us to see more clearly what Gramsci refers to as the two faces of fascism, because the solution on the part of the capitalist ruling class was that within mass administered democracies, there needed to be two things at least: massive propaganda campaigns to mobilize voters to support a false revolution, right? A revolution that was in the interest of the capitalist ruling class. It's a revolution of the ballot box, right? And that part of the fascist project is really important. And Zetkin, as we'll see in a moment, really highlighted the significance of the political element, right? The ideological element of fascism, of bringing the masses in. But the second element, of course, is an extra-legal fight to beat back the Bolsheviks. That's the reactionary wing. These are the street fighters, the white guards, etc. So with all of that in mind, let us turn to the responses that the Comintern had to fascism, so the Third International. Joshua from Atlanta in the registration question asked, what can we learn from past anti-fascist movements? And as we move through this, I'm again going to be relatively quick in order to tease out the big picture issues. But I think one of the really important things, for me at least, in reading back through a lot of the kind of history of communist organizing, is to recognize the extent to which self-critique is built into communist organizing. And so as we go through this process, we'll see the shifts and turns that were being taken by the Comintern were also a response to changing situations and to changing positions and kind of class struggle even within communist organizing itself, which is of course a very important part of communist organizing. It also demonstrates, of course, the materialist orientation, right? That 1922 is not 1933. So your response to fascism has to take that into account. So if we begin with the Fourth World Congress of the Comintern, which took place in 1922, we have the first major declaration made by the Comintern on the nature of fascism. At this point in time, there were a number of wavering positions in the internal communist debates on fascism. Was it mainly due to landowners? Was it driven by the industrial or commercial bourgeoisie? There wasn't a kind of settled position as of yet in that regard, but it did recognize that Mussolini's ascension to power on October 30th, 1922, quote, did not constitute a coup d'etat or a revolution. The class situation in Italy was unchanged. Right? This was critical to the split that took place in the Socialist Party in Italy and infighting that led to the Communist Party of Italy's refusal to unanimously fuse with the Socialist Party. So in short, what happened was that the Socialist Party of Italy, with fascism on the rise, and Antonio Gramsci and other important communists were involved with the Socialist Party at that point in time, took a relatively reformist position and was not at the kind of vanguard of the more revolutionary workers' movements like the general strike that had been organized in Turin that Gramsci was involved in. What the Comintern recommended in 1922 was for the Socialist Party, instead of being split, to be more consolidated, so that there was the recognition that there needed to be at least the beginning of a kind of coalitional force that could fight off the fascist beast. This is important because in Italy, Antonio Gramsci, as well as Amadeo Bordiga, both of whom at that point in time were part of the Socialist Party of Italy, were accused by the Comintern as being left deviationists. What they meant by that is that the Comintern called for a kind of united front policy, and I'll get into what that means in more detail in a moment, meaning basically a tactical alliance between the emergent Communist Party of Italy and the Socialist Party, which was more reformist, as well as the Italian Populists, a party that's referred to as the PPI. Both Gramsci and Bordiga refused this. And they refused it on the ground that the Socialist Party in Italy was opportunist and reformist, and that it had failed in its leadership of the workers' movements that they had been involved in. And so I think this raises a really important question of the relationship between the subjective experience of organizers, like Gramsci and Bordiga, who hated the socialists and did not want to forge a union with them, and the question of what it means to analyze class struggle from a more objective point of view, meaning from the outside, what would make the most sense within the Italian context. And Gramsci in this case, Bordiga eventually went in the direction of what's called the quote unquote left opposition and became a Trotskyist a few years later. Gramsci, though, later recognized that Lenin was right, and that he should have overcome his own subjective hatred of the socialists and recognized that the objective conditions within Italy required a united front orientation, which is I think, very interesting perspective on one of the very important anti-fascist organizers in the Italian context. And of course, Gramsci went on to become part of the, he went to Moscow and was then a representative to the Comintern. The next important intervention on the part of the Comintern that I wanted to highlight is there was a resolution on fascism at the third plenum of the Executive Committee of the Communist International in June 1923. Gramsci was present at that point in time in Moscow. He delivered a speech on the Italian question. Clara Zetkin was there as well. From Germany, and she'd been developing an analysis of fascism, a very important early analysis of fascism. Zetkin claimed, quote, "The mistakes of the Communist Party again lie above all in viewing fascism only as a military terrorist movement and not as a mass movement with deep social roots. It must be expressly emphasized that before fascism had won militarily, it had already achieved the victory politically and ideologically over the labor movement," end quote. In this regard, we see Zetkin really calling on the Communist International to take seriously the political and ideological elements to fascist organizing and not simply focus on the kind of more the military side of things. The characteristic feature of Italian fascism, as it was understood by the Comintern at that point in time, was, quote, "It consists in this, that the fascists not only form strictly counter-revolutionary fighting organizations armed to the teeth, but also try by social demagogy to gain a footing among the masses," right? So it sees both of these elements. It's an ideological project of indoctrination, and it's a militant project of mobilizing forces on the ground to crush communists, break strikes, etc. So the Comintern advocated at this point in time for a vigorous use of united front tactics, as well as, quote, "methods of illegal organization, which it deemed absolutely essential," right? I take it that these are I assume at least, that these are forms of organization that responded to the extra-legal, violent fascist bands by organizing the necessary kind of armed response to those fascist bands. At the same time, it claimed at this point that fascism was, quote, the last card in the bourgeoisie's hand, and that the attack on the foundations of bourgeois democracy on the part of fascism would lead to the broad masses to recognize that the rule of the bourgeoisie is possible only in the form of an undisguised dictatorship over the proletariat. In other words, the position of the Comintern was that fascism in taking over state power was kind of going to internally crumble because it wasn't going to be able to maintain its kind of mythological facade. Andrew from Kansas City in the registration question asked, what role has the Popular United Front played in past anti-fascist efforts? And what kind of role could they play in modern struggles? So the United Front is probably described most clearly in the Fourth World Congress in the following terms. Quote, the United Front tactic is simply an initiative whereby the communists propose to join with all workers belonging to other parties and groups and all unaligned workers in a common struggle to defend the immediate basic interests of the working class against the bourgeoisie, right? So this is bringing in communists, socialists, unaligned workers in a united front against fascism. You didn't need to agree ideologically with the people, you know, on every point, of course, with a particular party platform or other such things. The idea was that there was a worker solidarity that extended across ideological lines. In the Fifth World Congress, in the summer of 1924, the Comintern reacted to the latest defeat of the German Communist Party that took place in October 23, and released the following statement that began to consolidate the idea that Brian brought up last time of social fascism. Quote, the leading strata of German social democracy, right? This is the same group of people and party organizations that I was talking about earlier, the German Social Democrats. The leading strata of German social democracy are at the present moment nothing but a fraction of German fascism wearing a socialist mask. This is the core of the thesis of social fascism. They handed state power over to the representatives of the capitalist dictatorship in order to save capitalism from the proletarian revolution. And it's at this point in time that the Comintern began advocating for what they called a united front from below. So a united front from below is looking to link to workers beneath the organizational structures of parties like the Social Democratic Party in order to form a common front with them independently of their leadership, which obviously the Comintern is accusing of being ultimately pro-capitalist and pro-imperialist and not only aiding and abetting fascism, being a form of fascism. They claim that the slogan, this is the Comintern, the slogan of the United Front tactic in Germany is now unity from below, right? From workers and not from above, from the leadership. This was an appeal then to the masses of the workers to develop forms of resolute action in which they band together outside of party leadership. The Sixth Congress of the Comintern in 1928 then passed a new resolution on the character of fascism, and the outstanding feature of the Sixth Congress was an increasing identification between social democracy and fascism. Right? Bordiga actually reported from Italy that fascism, like social democracy, was basically a bourgeois party seeking mass support, and he claimed that it was a form of fascism. The German delegate said as much. The position of the Comintern was that, quote, fascism and social democracy are the two sides of the same instrument of capitalist dictatorship. In the fight against fascism, therefore, social democracy can never be a reliable ally of the fighting proletariat, end quote. There was also the presumption of the internal contradictions of fascism in power would continue to kind of help lead to its collapse, which I had mentioned earlier. So there was a continuation of this orientation, which is important because this will be adjusted in the Seventh Congress. I'll just note really quickly in passing, because I'm going to try to wrap up here in the next 5 or 10 minutes. In the breakout groups, there are 12 points that we've shared with you in the Google Doc that was circulated or will be circulated. I'm not sure of the order of operations. And these recommendations are taken directly from the 6th Congress, meaning there are 12 points regarding what the communist fight back against fascism should look like. And it's interesting that they're divided into 2 parts. One is the political sphere, for which there are 6 points, and the other is the military and organizational sphere, for which there are 6 points. And again, you see the ideological battle and the kind of military battle, right? The 2 faces of fascism for Gramsci. The question then of social fascism, I think, raises some very important issues regarding how we as communists are supposed to make sense of this heritage and what it has meant for the Comintern to kind of point out and accuse social democrats as being fascists themselves, because of the ways in which, because of what happened during the German Revolution, but then also what happened with the rise of the Nazi war machine within Germany and as well within Italy, the fascists within Italy. And so this raises some, I think, very interesting and crucial questions regarding the relationship between social democracy and capitalism, for instance, but then also questions about political tactics, right? Because if it's true from a certain theoretical point of view that social democracy was complicit in the rise of fascism, in the crushing of communist insurgencies, from the vantage point of communist organizers in the interwar period, you can understand that certain of them would be very distrustful of the social democrats, right? From a tactical point of view, I think it's also important, and this is one of the things that Brian highlighted, is to raise the question of, well, how useful was this from the point of view of kind of objective relation of forces to denigrate the social democrats at the moment in time at which they might have been able to be mobilized as allies in a common struggle, a more kind of broader united front struggle against the fascists. One final thing maybe that I'd say on that is, of course, the Marxist logic of tactics and strategies can be really helpful in kind of working through some of these issues. And tactics are simply the various methods kind of mobilized at precise points in time, whereas the strategy is the final goal, right? So if we're in capitalism and it's A in the alphabet and communism is Z, Z would be the strategy, and we can never lose sight of the strategy, right? But the tactic is how you get from A to B to C to D, and there's a lot of complex work being done there, right? And so it might be, strategically correct to say that the social democrats aren't going to get us to Z, and we have proof of that. But it might be tactically a very bad idea not to work with social democrats if you're trying to get, basically push back against fascism and make certain gains for the workers' movement. The victory of Nazism in 1933 led to a series of theses being published, and this was in the 13th Executive Congress plenum of the Comintern in 1933. And it's here that we see a pretty significant shift that is based on, to a large extent, the contributions of George Dimitrov, whose text hopefully you all read for this session. It's in 1933 that the Comintern then claimed, and these are basically the words of Dimitrov, quote, "Fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinist, and most imperialist elements of financed capital." So if nothing else, this definition at least made possible the formation of a broad anti-fascist coalition of many parties and groups. To this end, it was necessary to tone down the polemic against social fascism, right? This was a kind of ongoing process, but in August of 1935, at the 7th World Congress, the theses on the united front of the working class against fascism were proclaimed. And it's there that we see, there wasn't a kind of, as far as I know, a public rejection of the thesis of social fascism, but there was a clear shift tactically away from denigrating the social democrats to the need and the call for a united front, a united front that would also include people from with social democratic leanings. The United Front in action then meant that the Comintern in 1935 recognized that the best tactic at this precise moment was to form a united front, including with the Social Democrats, and to try to split the Social Democrats so that the revolutionary wing of the Social Democrats could be siphoned off and could then become basically part of the communist endeavor to fight back against fascism in a more revolutionary means, and that the reformist would be kind of set adrift. That that aspiration was really one then of kind of, instead of just rejecting social democracy as social fascism, recognizing that it was an opportunity for organizing to recuperate some of the Social Democrats for the communist cause. I'm just being vigilant about time here, so I'm going to jump through a few notes so I can wrap up in 2 minutes. Maybe the last thing that I'll highlight, and we'll cycle back to some of this, is that the recommendations for the United Front in 1935 then were to work with Social Democrats, quote, without for a moment giving up their independent work in the sphere of communist education, organization, and mobilization of the masses. Meaning the call for the United Front in 1935 wasn't, you know, forget about being a communist and just form a united front and no longer be kind of critical and call for revolutionary communism. No, on the contrary, be very vocal and very clear about what your positions are, but at the same time, form a tactical alliance. And this alliance was necessary, they claimed, in the need of a common set of mobilized actions, and in order to as well bring in the vast unorganized mass of toilers, right? So there was, maybe the last thing that I'd say is that at this point in time, particularly with the intervention of Dimitrov, there was a kind of expansion of the United Front tactic to include, there's some difference in how people will use their terminology, but what most people call a popular front. And so a popular front isn't only looking at forging a united front of kind of generally progressive political forces that tend to be more or less anti-capitalist, at least to a certain extent, or critical of actually existing capitalism. A popular front is a much more big tent approach that tries to bring in a larger spectrum of the working masses. And to do that, in order to ultimately shore up, as Dimitrov argues, the limited gains that even workers have under bourgeois democracy, right? So actually a defense of all of the rights that workers have been able to get out of the capitalist ruling class through class struggle from below within bourgeois democracy, right? So they claim, for instance, and I'll end with this quote, while being upholders of Soviet democracy, we shall defend every inch of the democratic gains which the working class has wrested in the course of years of stubborn struggle and shall resolutely fight to extend these gains, end quote, right? So you see this popular front struggle as also a defense of the rights that workers have gained within bourgeois democracy. I'll wrap up there and turn it back over to Claudia for the next step.
have most people. And so let's get started. So I hope that the group discussions were fruitful, productive, that people were able to engage, obviously, in deeper and very interesting conversations. We were able to follow with the notes that thankfully those note takers were sharing, and we are going to be referring back to those notes. Not necessarily at the moment. We are going to be looking into some of the questions that folks put on that document. But I think from the coordinating group, we understand that these are all ideas around party development. And so these are not necessarily for us to put out a position on right at the moment, but we're going to be sharing this document with the leadership of our party as a way of having, you know, folks know what is being thought at in the context or in relationship to the growth of fascist forces and elements in the United States, and what are we thinking from the different branches about that. And I think one of the groups, I think it was group 4, that put the reference of George Jackson, creating a revolutionary culture where we do not throw away our ideas, but unite to fight. And I was just mentioning to Gabriel and the rest of the folks in the coordinating group how important it is for us to build principled unity. It's not unity for the sake of unity, but it must be principled, and it must be under the agreement of a program, which means that we maintain our line. And it also means that we carry out the work for the advancement of the working class, for the larger purpose, for the strategy. And so tactical unity, thinking about it in that way and how important it is. And so we're going to be closing the chat, and we are going to have about 10 minutes or so of engaging with some of the questions that were placed on the chat during our previous break, and some of the questions that were placed on the note. Some of them may not, again, be addressed at this particular moment. There are still 2 more sessions to go, and some of them require more than a sentence response. So we will only address the ones that are related to the topic for today. And so are we all good? Folks feeling good still? Cool. Gabriel.
Thanks, Claudia. And thanks for all the great questions. They're wonderful. And also people have a lot of knowledge about the history of communist organizing and anti-fascist responses. So it's also great to learn so much from different comrades around the country. We just selected a few questions I'll go through in about 10 minutes and at least give some kind of elements of a response to begin or to continue the conversation that we were having earlier. Shinobi asked, can we explain the delineation between a united front against fascism and a popular front? And I was a little rushed at the end of my presentation, so I did want to return to this because these are terms that are used by different people in different struggles, right? So there's not a fixed and absolute definition of a united or popular front, but it's generally understood that a united front is smaller than a popular front, and that it tends to bring together groups around a common enemy. So most united fronts are united fronts between like socialists, communists, and anarchists against a common enemy like fascists. Whereas the popular front approach is much more expansive and tends to also work with centrist and liberal elements, certain social democratic elements. And so the idea is that the principled unity that Claudia was talking about would be identified as being shared not only across the kind of anti-communist left, or I'm sorry, there's too much of the anti-communist left, sorry about that, shared across the anti-capitalist left, but that there are interests that we also share with the kind of centrist and liberal spectrum of politics, and that it would be within that capacity that we would consider the use of popular fronts. Michelle from the Bay Area asks, what are some resources that talk about tactical wins and tactical defeats with employing the united and popular front tactics? I think this is an excellent question because it also points to the specificity of these tactics. I think that both the united front and the popular front approach, these are defensive tactics. They're not offensive strategies, right? The whole point is to try to save space so that communists and the anti-capitalist left in general is not crushed by the fascist assault. And so I do think that the question of kind of tactical wins and tactical losses is quite different in this regard, because a win from a united front wouldn't be that you defeat fascism, because in order to do that, you have to defeat capitalism, because capitalism is the driving force behind the manifestation of fascism, both ideologically and militarily. And so a win, I take it in that capacity, would be when there are communities that enter into a united or popular front, and they're able to keep the fascist beast at bay, right? Not defeat it, but keep it from turning the bourgeois democracy into an open dictatorship of capital, right? So this isn't a strategic win, right? It's only a tactical victory in that regard. And I mentioned this last time, but there are actually all capitalist countries in the wake of the Great Depression were sites of fascist mobilization, and there were fascist movements, but they did not succeed in gaining state power in the majority of them, actually. And so those who were involved in United Front tactics in that regard, insofar as they kept the state from turning openly fascist, we could call that a success. But again, a tactical victory, not a strategic success against fascism overall. And I want to return to this question as well when in my presentation, because we're going to talk about the Panthers and what they did within the US context to organize against fascism. It is true, of course, that ultimately, the Nazis rose to power, and so did the Italian fascists, and then they went on the warpath. And what ultimately and finally defeated, at least at the tactical level, fascism of that sort was the Red Army. And so another thing that we'd have to talk about, and I'm going to get into this in some of the other sessions, is what are the other responses that, including, military style responses. In fact, some communists were arguing, Trotsky being one of them, that the Red Army should have invaded and moved west and not waited until the Nazis moved east. And so the whole question of military organization for a straight up war against fascists is also, I think, a very, very important one. Catherine asked, where do we think we are currently in the development of fascism in the United States? Excellent question. There were a lot of questions about the DSA and our relationship to the DSA and other such things. I'm going to punt the question slightly, because next time and the time after, we're going to look at the history of the American racist police state, its relationship to fascism, both domestically and internationally. And I think that once we lay some of that groundwork, the whole point of laying that groundwork will be we'll have better visibility on what's going on in the present. And particularly, there were a number of questions around the assault on the Capitol. There was another question: how do we get the United Front going in areas where class unity is made difficult by large strata of wealthier workers and petty bourgeois? This, of course, the proof is always in the pudding. It depends on the concrete modes of organizing. But Claudia's reference to principled unity, I think, is extremely important. And that is that if you can identify what you share with other classes and use that as a focal point for one's organizing, then there's the possibility of building kind of cross-class alliances around either a united or a popular front. And part of that has to do with the ideological battle, the political educational battle of convincing people that it is in their best interest to keep fascists out of power, because the fascists historically have not only killed and crushed communists, they've also thrown social democrats under the kind of juggernaut of fascist violence, as well as liberals, right? And so they actually do have an interest and should have an interest in joining in those struggles. But of course, it's up to us to convince them of that. What would a global or national strategy look like when local situations and tactics vary a lot based on situation? Yeah. One of the great aspects, of course, of communist organizing is that it's always looking from the point of view of international class struggle, and understanding national and local context is nested within them. And so in many ways, what the Comintern was doing, and as we'll see, what the BPP was doing within the US, is organizing locally, but within the kind of larger logic of an internationalist response, so that there can be forms of obviously solidarity, but then also direct support of anti-fascist organizing. In the case of Spain, of course, there was the Spanish Civil War, which was a precursor to World War II, and was basically a confrontation in a nutshell between kind of fascist authoritarian forces on the right and then the more anti-capitalist forces on the left. And the international dimension of that was very important because the country that came to the aid of the Republicans within the Spanish struggle, which were the left-wing forces, was the Soviet Union. Right, and they provided military support, propaganda, obviously, organizational support, and all of that was integral to the ability on the part of the Republicans, at least to keep the Franco regime at bay for a certain amount of time before it eventually gained so much power that that was no longer possible. And the last question was about the assault on the Capitol, which of course we'll want to talk about mainly in the last section of the course, but we'll kind of build up to it. This has been very quick, but I feel like, Claudia, unless there's something else that I should either address or that you want to weigh in on, maybe I should move into the second part of my presentation.
You could feel free to go into the second portion of the presentation. I think you addressed the key questions that folks were raising.
Okay, yeah, and some of these we'll be cycling back to because they're very open-ended questions, and there's a lot more that could be said, of course. So what I wanted to look at now is the way in which the Black Panther Party in the United States picked up on the work of Dimitrov and the kind of final position of the Comintern in the mid-1930s that we left off talking about, and that is the need for a united front that was forged against fascism, while recognizing that that united front is not simply based on a shared political ideology or party platform, but instead shared on a kind of common interest in preserving ourselves against the fascist threat. And in the case of the BPP, one of the things that's interesting, and I think we should all be thinking about, is that when they identified kind of American fascism, one of the main things that they had in mind, and you saw this if you were able to read the copy of the Black Panther Party paper that we circulated, one of the main things that they had in mind was the US police force and the US military in its imperialism abroad, right? They were responding directly to the use of extreme force on the part of Ronald Reagan, who was then the governor of California, who used the National Guard, and I think there were over 2,000 members of the National Guard who attacked the students and the organizers in California, or injuring 128 of them and killing one of them. And so this manifestation of state violence that, of course, also relates to the COINTELPRO assault on any form of leftist organizing in the United States, was one of the main concerns with the Panthers for forming this united front against fascism. COINTELPRO, as I assume a lot of people probably know, is the counterintelligence program run by the FBI that was basically aiming at undermining, not only destabilizing, but assassinating and destroying the leadership of any organization on the left, really. I mean, this could, including, new left organizations that weren't even necessarily revolutionary organizations. And the extent of these operations was absolutely mind-boggling. There were some 295 COINTELPRO operations between 1956 and 1971 that were admitted by the FBI itself. And of course, this included killing 29 members of the Black Panther Party and 69 activists involved with the American Indian movement, right? So this was a brutal, brutal assault on organizing. And what they were calling out was a manifestation of fascism in the American context that wasn't exactly identical to what we were talking about in the interwar period, because it wasn't just the kind of the parastate elements that we were talking about, but it was the state itself. It was fascism in uniform, if you will. And so the Panthers began to organize in the late 1960s a united front against this fascist threat on the part of the American police state, as manifest in COINTELPRO, the work of Reagan and other forces. Obviously, the FBI was a big force in that regard. Kathleen Cleaver has a very interesting text in this regard entitled Fascism, Racism, and Political Murder. And she writes the following: The advent of fascism in the United States is most clearly visible in the suppression of the Black liberation struggle, in the nationwide political imprisonment and assassination of Black leaders, coupled with the concentration of massive police power in the ghettos of the Black community and across the country. The police departments nationwide are preparing for armed struggle with the Black community and are being directed and coordinated nationally with the US Army and the underground vigilante racist groups for a massive onslaught against Black people, right? So we see a more kind of direct and upfront form of fascism being identified by Cleaver. It's the vigilantes, but it's also just the authoritarian forces of the state that are being unleashed. This raises a kind of broader question of the relationship between a self-declared liberal democracy like the United States and these forms of authoritarian and fascist state violence that are being called out by the Panthers. And one thing I think that is important to think about is that sometimes certain both analysts and organizers will want to only see fascism when it takes its kind of vigilante forms. And that when it's wearing a uniform, somehow they'll want to refer to it as authoritarianism or a form of state repression or other such things. And it is true that from the point of view of the capitalist ruling class, there's a different logic that's operative, right? If you're mobilizing vigilante bands in order to crush workers' movements, this is different than sending out the police or the National Guard. But from the point of view of organizers and from the point of view of the Black Panther parties, if they're being attacked by vigilantes or FBI informants who are undercover, or if they're being attacked directly by the police, in certain instances, that doesn't make an enormous difference on the ground, right? Another way of saying this is that, you know, if a cop beats you up during the day because they're in uniform, or if they come with a hood at night and lynch you, this is a different tactic on the part of the capitalist ruling class, of course, but it doesn't make a big difference on the part of view of those, or from the point of view of those who are being subjected to these types of violence. And in fact, one of the things that the Panthers point out is the kind of continuity in the deeper history of Jim Crow America between the lynchings that were largely done by parastate forces and vigilante forces like the KKK and other organizations, and the assassinations by cops. And if you look at lynching statistics, of course, you know, between 1882 and 1968, and lynching statistics are hard to qualify because there are a lot of them that weren't reported. But one of the dominant statistics is around 5,000 people lynched between 1882 and 1968, majority of which were Black, 3,400 of them actually. When you compare that to contemporary police violence, in which approximately 1,000 people a year are being gunned down by the police, many of them unarmed, nonviolent, non-confrontational, etc., all of them poor, the majority of them racialized groups, then that continuity begins to make a certain amount of sense. And we begin asking or raising questions like the Panthers were raising. In their response then to what they perceived as this fascist assault, they organized an alliance and called for a united front against fascism in 1969. This was first a conference that they organized in July of '69, and it brought together over 5,000 people from hundreds of different radical organizations. These organizations, you know, it was coordinated by the Panthers, but the whole idea was that we needed a multiracial form of united front that would bring together all of those communities that are organizing for workers and for those who are targeted by racist police violence. The conference then focused on developing a platform that, while coordinated by the Panthers, wouldn't ultimately be under the political ideology of the Panthers. And in fact, the Panthers themselves stressed that white as well as Black workers are under the attack of fascist police and thus need to fight and control them. They brought in, as I mentioned a minute ago, a number of organizations that didn't share the same kind of political ideology of the Panthers. And this was because, as Bobby Seale said actually at this conference, quote, people have to see that they can't just identify fascism with the same old garments that fascism wore in history and in other countries. People have to realize that fascism is right in front of their noses in new garments, and they have to identify it and recognize it for what it is, fascism in America uses, for, according to Seal, two weapons, those of demagogy and mass terror, right? Again, we see the exact same points that Dimitrov makes that go back to even the work of Clara Zetkin. The police and the politicians then are identified as being financed and managed by businessmen working through the state and federal governments. The United Front Against Fascism then brought together these various groups and advocated for a platform that is not only very similar to that of Georgy Dimitrov from the Seventh World Congress in 1935, but actually kind of directly quotes him in various ways. The Panthers defined then fascism as, quote, the power of finance capital, which manifests itself not only as banks, trusts, and monopolies, but also as the human property of finance capital, the avaricious businessman, the demagogic politician, and the racist pig cop, end quote. The consequences from this United Front Against Fascism, or the UFAF, was that they then launched a series of national committees to combat fascism, NCCF, that was a multiracial, nationwide network to organize for community control of the police and a united front against the racist police violence that was being exercised on communities of color and working class communities in general. I'm just looking at the time, so I'm gonna kind of race through a few things here. Let me bring in at least two final points that I wanted to highlight. Among the Panthers, one of the people who, and I'm glad to see that this was highlighted in the chat and some of the questions, was really at the forefront of theorizing American fascism was George Jackson, who was the BPP field marshal in charge of prison recruitment. Jackson rejected the ideological particularization of fascism and pointed out all of the structural similarities between European fascism and repression in the United States, right? He referred to the United States as the Fourth Reich and called the police system, the system of mass incarceration in the United States as being the next step in the process of Buchenwald and the concentration camps in Germany. And he pointed out that fascism had three faces in its history. One is the face that it has when it's out of power, and it tends to be almost revolutionary and subversive, right? Because it's looking to gain state power. Secondly is when it's in power, but its power is not yet fully secure, so it tends to rely on very sensational forms of violence. I take it that what he has in mind here is when the Italians and the Germans first rose to power. But then thirdly, when it's fully in power and secure, it allows for some forms of dissent. And this is how he describes contemporary United States. There's a lot more that I could say and would love to say about Jackson, but I think just in the interest of time, I'm going to jump over a bunch of notes and get to his response to fighting fascism to highlight two things that I think is important. One is that he calls for unitarian conduct and revolutionary organizing, and he advocates for a united left that must renounce the idea that all participants must be of one mind. We should work at the problem, so we don't have to work at the problem from the point of view of a party line or a single method. So Jackson here is very much in line with Dimitrov, the idea of a united left that doesn't share just a specific party platform. But the other thing that he introduces that I think is quite interesting is the idea of a revolutionary commune. And a revolutionary commune, he says, is the way in which, and this made me think of a lot of the work that we're doing with PSL, he says, carving out a commune in the central city will involve claiming certain rights as our own, rights that have not been respected up to now, property rights. It will involve building a political, social, and economic infrastructure capable of filling the vacuum that has been left by the establishment ruling class and pushing the occupying forces of the enemy culture from our midst, right? So there's this logic that Jackson outlines of building power organically at the level of communities that push back against the capitalist onslaught and do it in such a way that the commune becomes a center for political education, for agitation, for organizing, for people, bringing people into the struggle and so forth. So I just wanted to highlight that as an additional tactic that I think is very important for all of us to be thinking about in the fight back against fascism. But in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up there and turn it back over to Claudia.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. We're literally just 6 minutes out before we close for this session, but it's really important and also really exciting and to think about the ways in which we could draw from history. Um, and also very scary how history repeats itself in a lot of ways within the system. Next week, we will be talking more along the lines of the state and police violence and all these other aspects and elements that folks brought up in the questions. So, you know, if we don't address the questions, rest assured, we will try. And also, you know, let's take this study as something that is prolonged, something that we all have to engage in our units, in our branches, engage more people in the conversation, because it's a hard time, a hard context, but history teaches us that we can and we will win. We just need to be able to engage as much as we can in collective conversations around these issues that sometimes seem overwhelming. I also wanted to draw from some of the things that Gabriel was talking about, specifically around George Jackson and the responses that he was sharing, and also in terms of the international, one of the focuses were this aspect of mobilization and education, how important cadre development is. Some of you mentioned, you know, on the question of training, and it's both theoretical and practical. And we are in such urgent times that we need to be able to do both. And in the context also in which we are, method and methodology are also important. And so as we are in this process of engaging in virtual learning, we don't only want folks to pay attention to the political content, but also pay attention to the methodology, because that's also a way of engaging people. And I just want to kind of put that in as a PSA, because a lot of the times we usually just pay attention to the content and not how. And how is also a way of organizing our people on the ground.